Judge Jonathan Harris sat at the elevated bench, his gavel in hand, scanning the list of cases for the day. His courtroom was orderly, the air thick with the weight of authority. His black robe swished as he adjusted his glasses, preparing for the next case. He had built a reputation for being strict but fair, someone who adhered to the law, no matter the circumstances. That's what his colleagues and the public respected about him. In his mind, the law was black and white. There was little room for gray areas. It was this adherence to justice that had earned him the position of influence he held today. Carla Turner, the court clerk called, breaking his concentration. A woman in her mid-30s, wearing modest but professional attire, stepped forward. Her face was calm, but the slight tremor in her hands betrayed the tension she felt. Carla had appeared before many judges in her life, but this was different. This was Judge Harris, the judge with the stern reputation, the one known for imposing heavy fines without hesitation. Carla took a deep breath, mentally preparing for what was to come. She had been speeding on the way to school, something she rarely did. But that morning had been different. Her son had fallen ill, and she was already running late for work. In her rush, she had failed to notice the flashing lights behind her until the officer had pulled her over. She explained the situation to the judge, offering a sincere apology, but it felt like her words were swallowed by the vastness of the courtroom. Judge Harris listened intently, but didn't show any sign of sympathy. He had heard similar excuses countless times, and in his experience, personal circumstances rarely excused breaking the law. His responsibility was to uphold the rules, no matter the situation. "Miss Turner," he said, his voice firm, "I understand your situation, but the law doesn't change for anyone. You were speeding, and that's a violation. I'm imposing a fine of $300. The word struck Carla like a blow. She hadn't expected him to show leniency, but the weight of that fine hit her harder than she could have imagined. She thought of her son at home, sick, and the bills that never seemed to stop piling up. She swallowed the lump in her throat, nodded respectfully, and left the courtroom, the sound of the gavel echoing in her ears. As she walked out, Carla felt a mix of frustration and helplessness. She was used to fighting, used to standing strong. But today, the weight of it all was different. She had hoped for understanding, maybe even just a moment of compassion. But instead, she had been reminded that in this world, justice often felt more like a rulebook than a lifeline. Carla Turner walked out of the courthouse, her heart heavy. The bright sunlight outside felt blinding, and for a moment, she couldn't bring herself to look at it. She had expected to feel relief after her brief court appearance, but all she felt was an overwhelming weight settling in her chest. The fine wasn't just a small inconvenience. It was a burden that threatened to tip the scales on everything she had been working for. She clutched the envelope containing the fine, the edges sharp against her skin. She couldn't help but think of the long days at the classroom, of the late nights grading papers and planning lessons. Teaching was her passion, but it didn't pay the bills. Her salary was modest, and the cost of living in the area had only gone up in the past few years. Every month, it felt like she was just barely keeping her head above water. Carla had always believed in the power of education. She had poured everything she had into her students, making sure that even the most challenging ones felt seen and heard. But today, sitting in that courtroom, she felt invisible. The fine was a reminder that her struggles, the sacrifices she made for her son, for her students, meant little in the eyes of the law. The judge had followed the letter of the law, yes, but there had been no room for understanding, no consideration for the life behind the mistake. She thought about the $300 fine. That amount of money could cover a week's worth of groceries, pay part of her rent, or maybe even take her son to the doctor. But now, it was another obstacle in a life already filled with challenges. Her car, which had been a lifeline to get to school each day, was on its last legs. She had been hoping to get it fixed soon, but now that was out of the question. The fine would have to come first. She couldn't afford both. As she drove home, her thoughts were a swirl of worry and frustration. The drive was quiet, and the hum of the engine seemed to echo the silence in her mind. She was doing everything she could to stay afloat, but the weight of it all seemed endless. At home, her son, Malik, greeted her with a tired but hopeful smile. She hugged him tightly, the warmth of his embrace a small comfort. "How was school, Mom?" he asked, his voice soft. Carla smiled, brushing the worry from her face. "It was good, baby. How about you?" But inside, she knew the storm was only beginning. The next few days passed in a blur for Carla. The constant juggle between teaching, taking care of Malik, and managing her bills left little room for rest. Each day, she found herself sinking deeper into a routine that barely allowed her to keep her head above water. But there was one bright spot: her work with her students. She poured her heart into them, determined to make a difference in their lives, even if it felt like the world outside the classroom was against her. One afternoon, as Carla prepared for a session with her students, the school principal stopped by her classroom. "Carla," he said, "I've got an assignment for you. We've noticed Ethan and Olivia Harris have been struggling a bit in class. I'd like you to help them out after school." Carla nodded, already adjusting her schedule in her mind. Ethan and Olivia Harris. The names rang a bell, but she couldn't quite place them. She was familiar with most of her students, but not these two. The principal continued. "Their father, Judge Harris, has requested extra help for them. I know you've got a lot on your plate, but I think you're the right person for the job." The mention of Judge Harris made Carla's stomach twist. She didn't say anything, but her mind raced. Judge Harris, the same man who had fined her so harshly just days ago. Her first instinct was to politely decline. But the principal, who had always been supportive of her, was counting on her. She took a deep breath and agreed, knowing it was another responsibility she couldn't avoid. That afternoon, when the tutoring session began, Carla walked into the room and froze. Standing by the door, ready to leave, was Judge Harris. He was tall, in his usual dark suit, his posture straight and professional. His eyes met hers, and for a brief moment, there was an uncomfortable silence. She could feel her pulse quicken, the memories of the courtroom still fresh in her mind. "Miss Turner," Judge Harris said with a polite but distant smile, "I see we meet again." His tone was cordial, but Carla couldn't help but sense a subtle awkwardness. It was as if he recognized her, but his demeanor hadn't shifted, still the same judge who had upheld the law without question. She nodded stiffly, trying to keep her composure. "Judge Harris," she said, her voice calm but distant, "it's a pleasure to meet you again." She didn't want to bring up the fine. It didn't feel like the time or place. Instead, she focused on his children, who were sitting quietly at their desks, their faces reflecting the same mixture of curiosity and apprehension that Carla often saw in her own students when they faced something new. "Let's get started," Carla said, pushing her unease aside and focusing on the task at hand. She had a job to do, and this was about the kids, not the awkwardness between her and their father. But as she started working with Ethan on his reading, she couldn't shake the feeling that this would be the beginning of something much more complicated. The first tutoring session was, by all accounts, a quiet one. Carla tried to focus on Ethan's reading comprehension, while Olivia, sitting at a desk nearby, worked through her math problems. The air in the room felt thick, though with the presence of Judge Harris. It wasn't just the awkwardness of seeing him again, but the realization that this was no longer a professional environment, where they could simply be teacher and judge. Their worlds had collided in ways neither had anticipated. Judge Harris stood in the doorway for a moment longer, watching his children with a practiced, calm expression. His presence loomed in the background, though he didn't intervene. Carla's gaze flicked toward him occasionally, but she kept her focus on Ethan, hoping the tension would ease with time. "You're doing well, Ethan," Carla said, encouraging him as he sounded out a difficult word. Ethan looked up at her, his brow furrowed but grateful. He was a bright child, but his reading had always lagged behind, and Carla was determined to help him improve. "Thanks, Miss Turner," Ethan said shyly, his voice soft but sincere. Carla smiled and nodded, then turned to Olivia. Let's go over this equation one more time, okay? Olivia's face lit up with a small smile, the relief clear in her eyes as she realized the numbers were starting to make sense. Judge Harris remained in the background, occasionally offering a comment or asking if they needed anything. His voice was polite, professional, but there was an undertone that Carla couldn't quite read. Was he aware of the awkwardness, or was he truly oblivious? She didn't know, but either way, it didn't matter. She was here for the kids, not for him. An hour passed, and the session seemed to be going well. Ethan made noticeable progress, and Olivia's confidence grew with each problem solved. Carla felt a sense of satisfaction as she helped the children grasp concepts that had once eluded them. There was something profoundly rewarding about seeing them understand, even if it was just for a few minutes at a time. Finally, the session ended, and Carla stood to gather her materials. Ethan and Olivia quickly packed their bags, eager to leave for the day. "Thank you, Miss Turner," Olivia said, her voice warm. "You're welcome," Carla replied with a smile. "You both did great today." Judge Harris stepped forward, offering a brief but genuine smile. "I just wanted to thank you personally for your time and patience with them, Miss Turner. They've really been struggling lately." Carla nodded, holding his gaze for a moment before breaking eye contact. "It's my pleasure, Judge Harris. I'm just doing my job." He paused, his brow furrowing slightly, and for the briefest second, she caught a glimpse of something like guilt in his expression. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a more neutral demeanor. "I'll be sure to pass along the feedback to the principal. I appreciate your dedication." As the judge left the room, Carla exhaled quietly, her shoulders tensing. She had gotten through the session without letting the past intrude too much, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the last time their paths would cross in this way. The next few tutoring sessions passed with surprising ease. Carla found herself growing more comfortable around Ethan and Olivia, their initial nervousness fading into familiarity. Ethan was slowly starting to enjoy reading, and Olivia, who had always struggled with math, seemed to gain confidence with each equation she solved. Carla was proud of their progress, and she began to feel a sense of purpose in her work with them. The children were smart, kind, and eager to learn. They just needed someone to believe in them, and that was something Carla was more than happy to do. Judge Harris, however, remained a distant figure. He continued to drop his children off for their tutoring sessions, sometimes staying to observe but never engaging in conversation with Carla beyond a polite thank you at the end of each session. Still, Carla couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting. The more she saw of him, the more she realized there was more to the judge than his reputation in the courtroom. She'd heard whispers about him, how he was tough but fair, a stickler for the law, and someone who would never bend the rules, no matter the situation. But in the few moments they shared in the school, there was a quiet tension that made her wonder if there was more to the man behind the robes. One afternoon, as Carla worked with Olivia on a particularly tricky set of multiplication problems, Judge Harris approached the table. This time, his expression was less formal, more relaxed. "Miss Turner," he began, his voice a little softer than usual, "I just wanted to thank you again. I've noticed a real difference in them. They're both more engaged with school than they've been in a long time." Carla smiled, setting down the worksheet. "It's my pleasure, Judge Harris. They're wonderful kids. They just needed a little encouragement." He nodded, glancing over at Ethan, who was deep in concentration, and then back at Carla. "I've always been proud of them, but I think they needed someone like you. Someone who sees the potential in them beyond grades." Carla's heart tightened at his words. There was something genuine in his tone, a vulnerability she hadn't expected from the stern judge. She looked at him, and for a moment, it felt like the judge was no longer just the man who would find her. He was a father, concerned about his children, wanting the best for them, just like any other parent. "I don't know how much of a difference I'm making," Carla said, her voice a little quieter. "But I know they're trying, and that's what matters." Judge Harris gave her a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Well, from where I stand, that's everything." There was a brief silence, and for the first time, Carla felt like they were standing on the same ground. Their shared understanding of what it meant to care for someone, whether it was a child, a student, or a community, had bridged the gap between them. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As the session came to a close, Carla and the judge exchanged another polite, but this time warmer, farewell. She watched as he left with his children, and for the first time, she didn't feel the weight of the courtroom hanging between them. It was replaced with the quiet understanding that perhaps there was more to their story than they both had initially thought. The days that followed the tutoring sessions felt different for Carla. There was a new sense of purpose in her work with Ethan and Olivia. The children were progressing faster than she had expected, and their enthusiasm for learning was infectious. Even the most difficult lessons now seemed to click for them. Carla felt a deep satisfaction in helping them overcome their struggles, but there was also a growing unease as her interactions with Judge Harris became more frequent. It wasn't just that he was the same man who had fined her. Over the past few weeks, she had noticed subtle changes in his demeanor, glimpses of vulnerability she hadn't expected from someone as rigid and unyielding as him. The polite gratitude he expressed after each tutoring session was different now. There was a sincerity in it, an unspoken acknowledgement that he appreciated the effort she was putting into his children's future. One afternoon, as the session ended and the kids gathered their things, Judge Harris approached the desk with an unusual hesitation. "Miss Turner," he began, his tone softer than usual, "I've been meaning to ask you something." Carla looked up from the material she had been organizing. She could feel her heart rate pick up slightly, unsure of what to expect. She had gotten used to their brief, cordial exchanges, but now there was something different in the air. "I've been thinking a lot about that day in court," he continued, looking almost uncomfortable. "And I realize I may have been too quick to issue the fine." Carla froze for a moment, her eyes locking with his. The words she had been waiting to hear, but hadn't truly expected, hung in the air between them. The judge was admitting fault, something that seemed almost out of character for him. "I didn't know your circumstances at the time," he said, voice lower now, a hint of regret in his words. "I never took into account that you were just trying to do your best. I should have shown more understanding." Carla swallowed hard, the weight of his apology sinking in. She had spent days thinking about that moment in court, feeling the sting of his decision. But hearing him say this, seeing the earnestness in his eyes, was a different experience. It was humbling, disarming. "Judge Harris, I appreciate you saying that," she replied, her voice steady, though her chest tightened with emotion. "But what's done is done. I understand that you have a job to do, just like I do. It's just, I guess I wasn't prepared for how hard it would be, to be judged by someone who didn't know me." He nodded, looking down at the floor for a brief moment, as if weighing his next words. "I can't undo what happened, but I'd like to make it right," he said. "I'll cover the fine for you, Miss Turner. It's the least I can do." The offer hung in the air between them. Carla was taken aback. She had never imagined a judge, someone who had shown no leniency before, would make such an offer. But she couldn't deny the sincerity in his voice. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. It wasn't just the fine that had hurt her. It was the feeling of being dismissed, of being judged without context. But now, standing in front of him, she felt like something had shifted, like there was a chance for them both to see each other differently. Carla stood there, stunned by Judge Harris's offer. The words hung in the air between them, and she could feel a mixture of emotions rising inside her: surprise, disbelief, and something else, something closer to relief. She hadn't expected this kind of gesture from the judge. In fact, she had never imagined him to be the type to go out of his way to make amends. His reputation had always been one of strictness, someone who never let personal feelings interfere with his decisions. Yet here he was, offering to cover the fine he had imposed on her, an offer that felt both generous and humbling. I don't know what to say," Carla finally managed, her voice quieter than she intended. She hadn't expected this kind of empathy from him, especially after the way he had treated her in the courtroom. She had prepared herself to hold on to her resentment, to view him as a distant authority figure who had no real understanding of the struggles she faced. But now, with him standing before her, offering to fix something that had weighed heavily on her mind, she wasn't sure what to feel. "I don't want you to think I'm trying to erase what happened," Judge Harris said, sensing her hesitation. "I know I can't undo the way I treated you in court, but I do believe in fairness, and I've realized I could have been more compassionate. I don't want you to struggle because of a mistake I made." Carla felt a small knot loosen in her chest. It wasn't just about the fine. It was the acknowledgement of her humanity, of the struggles she had faced. It felt like he was seeing her as more than just a defendant in his courtroom. "I appreciate that," she replied, her voice steadier now. "But I can't let you pay the fine. I'm still responsible for it." She paused, thinking for a moment. "It's just a part of life, you know. We all make mistakes. I'll find a way to manage." Judge Harris seemed to consider her words, his expression thoughtful. He didn't argue, but instead nodded, a quiet understanding passing between them. "If you change your mind, you know where to find me," he said, his tone not forceful but genuine. Carla smiled, a small, grateful curve of her lips. "Thank you. But I'll be okay." She hesitated, then added, "I'm just glad we're talking like this, instead of just in a courtroom." He smiled back, a fleeting moment of warmth crossing his features. "Me too. I think we both have more to learn about each other." As they stood there, the distance between them seemed to shrink, not just in the physical sense, but in a way that Carla hadn't expected. There was no longer a judge and a teacher standing in front of one another, but two people who had been given a chance to see each other's humanity. And though the fine wasn't resolved, something deeper, something more meaningful, had shifted in their relationship. As Carla watched Judge Harris walk away, she couldn't help but feel a sense of unexpected gratitude. The fine might still be there, but the sting of the moment in court was gone, replaced by a feeling of shared understanding. It was a small, but important, victory. The following weeks were filled with unexpected shifts in Carla's life, all stemming from that moment with Judge Harris. The tension between them had dissipated, replaced by a growing respect that neither of them had anticipated. As they continued their tutoring sessions, both with Ethan and Olivia, and in their brief exchanges before and after, a new sense of mutual understanding blossomed. It was as though they had both learned to view each other through a different lens, one that was less about the rigid roles they played and more about the shared humanity they now recognized in each other. Carla still wrestled with the reality of the fine. Her finances were tight, and the weight of that $300 still lingered in the back of her mind. But the offer from Judge Harris had been a turning point. She had turned it down, but something about the sincerity in his voice had shifted her perspective. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the acknowledgement that she wasn't just another case in his courtroom. She was a person, a mother, a teacher, doing her best in a world that often seemed stacked against her. One day, as the tutoring session concluded, Carla was packing up her things when Judge Harris stopped by again, this time without his usual formality. He wasn't in his suit, but instead dressed casually, a far cry from the stern figure she had seen preside over the courtroom. He smiled as he approached her desk, holding a small envelope. "I've been thinking a lot about our conversation," he began, his voice more relaxed than she'd ever heard it. "And I realized I didn't want to just leave things unresolved between us. I respect your decision not to accept the offer, but I wanted to do something for you, in a way that feels right." Carla raised an eyebrow, but said nothing, intrigued by the envelope in his hand. "I've spoken with the principal," he continued, "and I'd like to offer you a small scholarship fund for your classroom. You've been doing so much for Ethan, Olivia, and the other students here, and I know how hard it can be to make ends meet when you're working so tirelessly. I'm not offering this as charity," he added quickly, seeing her startled expression. just as a gesture of appreciation for the work you do. Carla stood there, momentarily speechless. The envelope contained a check that would cover several months' worth of classroom supplies and allow her to provide even more for her students. It was a substantial amount, one that would make a real difference. But more than that, it was a recognition of her efforts, something she hadn't expected from someone like Judge Harris. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady but filled with gratitude. "This means more than you know." Judge Harris nodded, his gaze softening. "You've made a difference in their lives, Ms. Turner. It's the least I could do." As he left, Carla stood in the quiet classroom, the weight in her chest finally lifting. She realized that sometimes the most unexpected gestures could change everything. It wasn't just about money or favors. It was about recognition, understanding, and the realization that sometimes people could surprise you. Judge Harris had not only seen her as a teacher but as a person, and that was something she would never forget. The fine was long forgotten now, replaced by something far more meaningful, a connection based on mutual respect and kindness. And with that, Carla felt a renewed sense of purpose.